that whole Moat and Bailey thing, that colonial model, that's if you're moving into a harsh climate or a harsh land or whatever. But if that harshness is coming to visit you and you're not aware of it, that's that's even worse. That's going to hit you upside the head without you knowing what's going on, especially if it happens fast.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I always try to bring you the forward-looking, bending around the curve in our society. What's next? What's happening? I'm super excited to announce, we launched on Cardano blockchain, but now up on Aptos and Solana, and I'm with Ted Marchildon again. The blending of what I would call, blockchain agriculture with real-world assets, and these two before disconnected realms, for a better word, of just physical plant growth, indoor agriculture machinery is now overlapping with what we consider blockchain technology and NFTs in this real world asset class. It's new, it's innovative, and we ran out of time the last time we spoke, and Ted and I had been trying to get back on here because of the launch on Solana and Aptos. And as well, the first was Cardano. So I just wanted to bring you some updates. And there were a lot of thoughts that we were trying to sandwich together last interview that escaped because of time, but we reined them back in. So Ted, appreciate you having me back on. Come on the show here, explain a little more about where this new world is moving to in terms of lifeboats for our society, because we need to eat every day. And the disruptions we're seeing with climate, economy, and now civilization. We're at like this precipice, perfect point on a teeter-totter, and where do we go from here? So the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Dave. Always a pleasure. The thing that the one word that jumped out at me that you just mentioned was boat, and which makes me think of the Ark. And how I'm always asking how many people got on the Ark, and in a percentage wise, not very many. So you had an option, right? If you knew about it. But it seems like our people running this place didn't want that many people surviving. So, I was just looking at my favorite Buckminster Fuller quote, which is, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And that's, where we're at. As far as I'm concerned, we've polluted the land, the water, the air. We're kind of getting squeezed into a corner, and everything really is available. The elements are always the elements, right? It's just about arranging them into something that optimizes that. So, if you look at the binary code, you can have a dot and a dash, but if that dot is the yang expanding and that dash is the yin receiving, the optimum relationship there is the bullseye, right? The thing in the middle is outputting, and the receiver is that ring around the outside. Well, that's what the rotary garden looks like from the end, right? And then continuing on with that binary optimization, you get the dome in the middle of the habitat ring. There's your farndominium. It's been done before. You showed it last time. You pulled up the Moat and Bailey and all these things. One of the comments in the last one we did was how far this is away from being implemented. And I responded, it's just everything's there ready. Now it's just about coming together and actually doing it. So another somebody I was talking to on the phone said, "Well, if my crypto just hits this week, then we'll be ready to buy in." And I was like, I resemble that remark. if mine hits this week, I'll do it without anybody's help. Bill, the day will come. Well, we'll see how that works.
This is not a toothpaste. It's a revolution for your teeth. Remineralize, strengthen teeth, all natural ingredients, essential oils, minerals, salts. Alpha Vedic Dental Solutions System. That's alphavedic.com/civilization. We're always trying to bring you the best products here that we think will enhance your life, especially if supply chains break down further or if there's some disruption in our lives here. It seems in the news more and more possible, but hey, who knows? Maybe it's a mind game. But what is not is keeping your dental health up. And not a lot of people are talking about this. We always see the storable foods. But what about dental care during these same emergency situations? Will your toothpaste eventually run out? Well, if it does, then what? So, like I say, this whole micro gut biome is driven by your oral cavity first. So, take a look at what they have, alphavedic.com/civilization. Every purchase you make helps keep our live radio show and podcast on air, bringing you more information just like this. alphavedic.com/civilization. That link is in the show notes below. And as always, I appreciate your valuable time and joining us in this ever and most important conversation as we move forward in our world.
But I want to live in one of these things. If my food was there and I didn't have to go anywhere, to get anything that I wanted done, and I was in a climate hardened system, I'd be a happy camper. Not that I'm not happy already, but that would solve so many things. I'd be thinking, okay, well, I think we've won now. What's the prize, right? What's the prize?
And Ted, you read through the comments on that last talk we had, and I did as well. It was all about recycling money, time, energy, and the whole thing. This really long comment was about energy makes the world go round, and this time around, or I should say, the last time or this time we're in now, it's all about oil being the energy. But then at the bottom couple paragraphs, it was like the world we're moving into, the semiconductor chips are going to be the new energy. So we're transitioning from an oil-based system into a electrical processing system. And these two worlds blending together from a physical world, because you do need the physical chips to create the output, which is the digital, but you need the physical to do it. So they're trying to weave these two concepts together, at least in this really long, well thought out post that had come through. And it was all about water recirculation systems too. You talked to some certain heights. I think you said, the top of the dome itself would create some sort of clouds or mist that could be reharvested. So that whole, chain of events from like, okay, recirculating energy, recirculating capital, recirculating water, kind of all fits in this same transition period of one system to another, but they need to overlap, but they need to recycle within themselves. And that brings you back to that yin yang you were talking about there. So you think you could comment on, water capture in the system, and I should say saving energy or recycling energy within the system?
We are so energy efficient. I was hoping the artificial intelligence that I'd be able to throw some questions on that and get some backup as to what the efficiency increase is to what we're doing versus greenhouse operations. So, transpiration rates for the plants, if you can get your water to the plant, it transpires something like 200 to 1,000 pounds of water to leave you with a pound of dried plant material. And that's assuming you're getting the water to the plant. The plant's picking up all that water. When you're watering the field, uh, how much of that water gets to the plant, how much gets lost, how much gets washed down into the water system. So you've got that efficiency. Uh, the the light overhead model versus when they count lumens, they count in 12 directions. So one candle is they count it in 12 directions coming off that candle to give you that count. One candle equals 12 lumens somehow. So in a greenhouse, you're only getting what's at the bottom, or even if you're doing what we've seen in the vertical farming world, the top-down lit system, to do the rotary, you instantly increase that part of it by 12 times. And then the rotation, you've seen the plants that are rotated versus the ones that are static. That's about five times increase. Plus, it's compressing that growth. Plus, it's auto-pollinating. It's doing so many things there that give you an increased multiplier. The Kardashev scale, I don't know if we mentioned that last time. Uh, it's kind of weird math. It makes people's eyes roll back so hard they're looking at the bottom of their brains. But it's pretty damn simple, and it's kind of binary scale again. But it's a bit like, okay, the flatland, the rotary garden with the centric light, and then a cluster of those. So that's really what the Kardashev's an astrophysicist looking out into what are we looking for when we look out into space? Who are we trying to find? How do we recognize them? So type one is planet-wide mastery, type two is solar system mastery, type three is galactic mastery. So type one, I would argue, that's flatland gardening. Type two is rotary gardening. Now you're into a light-centric solar system. That's type two. And then type three is a cluster of those. So according to Kardashev, each step was 10 million times efficiency increase and would take 100,000 to a million years of human evolution. I look at it and think, well, we're never going to see a type three. We're never going to, that's just not a human scale. But if you can shrink that concept down, pull a Dr. Seuss on it, shrink it down to the point where it actually has an effect on a human. Now that's what we're talking about with this gardening thing. And if you're doing it in an effect that's agriculture, and we're already actually working with a type one archetype in greenhouse models and just on the outside of the planet, that's here's your type one. If you can shrink that down and give yourself type three, does that give you 10 million squared over what we're doing in a greenhouse? And we do a lot of greenhouses. If you look at how many acres there are greenhouses globally, there's a lot. There's like hundreds of thousands of acres. It's
Oh,
mostly in
just in
Europe.
Almeria in Spain, that's the world's largest facility. There's at least, yeah, multiple tens of thousands of acres completely encapsulated, completely controlled. Some of them are, CO2 light controlled, others are just the very what you consider rudimentary covered cloth type, but they're still trying to control light inside there. That was ripped to shreds with all the new hailstorms coming and the intensity of the storms. It's another thing to think about as to how do you protect all this, because I was just Almeria in Spain. I tell you, take a look at that from the satellite view. It will absolutely, again, send your eyeballs rolling back on what? That's part of the bottom of a peninsula that's covered with greenhouses.
And then you go up into Northern Europe, the Netherlands and whatnot. Now they've got pricier greenhouse operations up there, right? All the glass and all the artificial lighting. And it works out to, I think it's 14 watts per square foot. But it's so far away, it's 10 feet up, that lighting. Nothing, if that was a warehouse, nothing, you would get nothing usable from that light to plant relationship. It's way too far away. And it's just lame. All it's doing is actually keeping the plant, it's an annoyance relationship. It's keeping the plants awake at night so they don't go to seed because they don't have long enough day hours there for most of the year. So that's a really kind of crazy relationship to be investing in. Well, we're annoying our plants, and the amount of energy that's put into that effect is quite staggering. Really, I mean, it would be several Three Gorges dams, if you want to put it in something that sort of doesn't make any sense. But it's so if you could, multiply that by 10 million times 10 million. what's the bottom line? What's the return on that? Obviously we've never done it right, because we don't have any civilizations that have stuck around through these cycles you're talking about. We always, scrub it and start over, apparently. Or maybe a new team gets punted onto the field, depending on what your universal view is of how we exist here.
But again, the water capture and recirculation in this thing was, people were talking about, in the last interview, the comments were coming through. They were trying to figure out the height of this dome, and you were talking about burying it partially underground to save on heating and cooling, etc. In the middle of the Saudi desert. I mean, bury this thing under the sand in the northern areas of the oil slope for those companies up there that were interested in using it. Wouldn't be so bad because you're extricating heat out of there when a lot of heat build up. So it's easier in Arctic climates to use this in extreme zones. But what were the types of numbers that you had of recirculation capture water? Understood it's going to be high, but then this mist and this fog that's going to be on the machines at the top of the dome, like how is that taken care of? For, do you have to use fungicides in this? Must you use herbicides? I mean, you're taking that whole element away of anything that's falling down on top from the atmosphere, from the jet fuel particulates, and there's an enormous amount of things coming in our atmosphere or released in the atmosphere that drift down and get into the soils. Now, you're taking that away for complete control of the atmosphere, and also what goes into that space there can be completely controlled, including nutrients. But those were the two things that had caught my eye. Okay, these things are going to be what? The size of a 30-story building, 20-story building. The
15.
evaporative effect, when you get up to the top layer of machines at the very top, how are you going to be able to control what would be regular issues that are trying to be with ventilated greenhouses, air movement, all this type of thing, and the water capture? And I guess that ran together in one single thread as well, those 2 points.
Well, we're just using regular condensation systems. So you're gonna collect that. You're gonna be, taking that air from the top. You have to, you've got heat rising. So you're gonna have to collect that plus yeah, the evaporative stuff, all that plant transpiration is gonna be in the atmosphere. So you have to deal with it or else you're gonna get clouds and you and then you're gonna have rain. You gotta control that. So the capture rate, I mean, the only thing that's going to get out of the system is going to leave in the form of food. So there's no runoff, there's no evaporation that can escape the system. And there are ways, depending on, where we are with power, you can use falling water to create power. So, we can play around with that. High noon runs a very narrow spectrum of the surface of the planet where, the sweet spot, the Goldilocks zone, is not like a high percentage of the planet. It's a low percentage of the planet that's Goldilocks. But if you do this with it,
Now, where would that Goldilocks zone be currently on the planet? Obviously, it's not going to be in Michigan or Canada, but where's it going to be then? Like just natural living Goldilocks. You don't need all the extra things to protect you through brutal winter cold seasons. Where would that Goldilocks be? Just for example, for anybody listening.
well, you're 30 degrees north of south of the equator. I mean, usually that's what you think of, right? But, if you're right on the equator, well, that's kind of a nasty part of the Goldilocks zone, right? Too hot there for the most part. And we obviously aren't very well equipped for that. We burn.
Okay, so this sort of water recirculation and perhaps adding an element or removing an element that lies, whether I should say different chemicals or molecules out of the water, then what does that do for the plant growth, and how does that help with our cells and our physiology in the body by putting in something that has an element removed out of it?
Well, according to someone I know who's working on the deuterium question, his plants are growing much faster using water that is deuterium depleted. So he's actually building equipment to do this, and of course, I want to use that equipment to do what we're doing. So plants grow faster, and apparently, and this guy looks way younger than his years. Now, not that that is evidence for anything, but it was certainly an impressive argument, or helped anyway visually when he was describing to me what it is he's doing.
So the ability to control clean food is the output with every single input controlled down to the nth degree then. So why would somebody be interested in joining in one of these blockchain products that crosses genres into the real world asset NFT category of machinery and blockchain agriculture? I mean, what's the advantage of somebody purchasing an NFT, getting in, and combining these two worlds? I mean, I can just go out and buy veggies at the store. So tell me
Sure,
the advantage of that. I mean, right now, there's a supermarket. I hear that a lot when I try to explain about, uh, the easterlies right now are in a negative flow, but what that means is they're more easterly than normal and faster, and it's pegged the charts. So what we're seeing along the equator right now is the easterlies overtaking westerlies when it should be on strong westerlies, but the easterlies are overtaking that to the point it's literally off the chart. It's in the area they can't measure. That's how far off the chart it is. So the ground level winds, across different parts of Africa and Indonesia, the monsoons affected intertropical convergent zone. And I'll say that, and people are like, "Well, dude, there's still food in the supermarket." Okay, I get it, but things are vastly changing now. They're not going to change, I don't think, in just like a flash of a pan. Although through history, there's been these instant events that have. But it seems like this one is just moving itself along slowly, 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 because we're talking about planetary systems. They're not going to flip in a matter of seconds and you're going to notice in front of you. So I still get this. There's food in the supermarkets. Why would I even grow my own food? But with the blockchain agriculture aspect of it, you're taking it to the point where now it becomes an investment in the future of different technologies combining. Valid question. I've had it asked a couple of times. So I thought I'd
sure.
throw it out.
You vote, with your dollars on what kind of system you want to be in. Uh, there's a story about a farmer trying to catch the geese. He's not good at catching these geese. They're too smart. They're too weary. They're too fast. And so the farmer he starts leaving food out for them. And they get accustomed to this food. They're eating the food. They like the food. And then they get fat and lazy and not too sharp. And eventually they don't go anywhere. And then he can easily catch them after a while of feeding them. So there's an argument there that, right, cheap food isn't necessarily to your benefit. That whole Moat and Bailey thing, that colonial model, that's if you're moving into a harsh climate or a harsh land or whatever. But if that harshness is coming to visit you and you're not aware of it, that's that's even worse. That's going to hit you upside the head without you knowing what's going on, especially if it happens fast. In the 70s, sometime they had that Buffalo storm, where they dropped like 9 foot of snow on Buffalo. And I remember Leonard Nimoy on some show, In Search of maybe or
That
something.
was it. Yeah, they were talking about the blizzard, and might I add, the most interesting point was they had traced back the different ice sheets, and they said the seed point of that glaciation event occurred in Nunavut in Canada. That they could trace it all the way back to the way the growth was, to the way it shrunk, all the way back to that. Seed Point in Nunavut, and they really thought that there was another ice age onsetting at that point. Remember the Buffalo Blizzard? The Army had to come in and all that stuff. I mean, you were more familiar. I'm just reading about the historicals, accounts from it. But I mean, you would have probably seen that on the news live of still stuck in blizzards and you can't get food into the city. But that was a real concern. Was the ice age was upon us, Leonard Nimoy, and then suddenly it flipped into DiCaprio. No, we're going hot, and now it's starting to, I guess, flip back to record cold across Antarctica. That displaced. There was a sudden stratospheric warming event just down there last. It was few weeks back. Displaced the almost. It was 109 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and they had thought it might hit the all-time world coldest record at 120 Fahrenheit degrees below negative. And that got displaced and pushed up to Chile and Argentina and closed the border crossing because it was too cold to operate. So border crossings closed because of the cold event. Now you're telling me that nations are going to stop their international trade because it's what? It's too cold. Now, this is not something we're hearing, but it's trending back toward this. So, perhaps there was clues that they thought, and then they got that last, you ever run out of gas? Not in today's automobiles, but in the older ones where you'd get that last really burst where the carburetor would kick in and give it that, and then it would, was that last firing of whatever kind of vapor was left in the engine to re-energize it for just that last split second or two. Is that what we just experienced over through the 1990s and into the 2010s? And now we're, revving down into the what was predicted, and we had that last spurt of energy, but now we're starting to, eke off of that into a downtrending, wouldn't say ice age immediately, but cooler plus cooler and continuously cooler environment. If it is, then we've been warned about the wrong thing. And I think that's a travesty. Excuse me for hogging so much time. Go ahead, please.
No problem. Well, I was on the north side of Lake Ontario during that blizzard.
Oh, you were? Okay. I want to hear the first-hand account. Give it to me.
Well, the thing is, the winds coming south towards Buffalo, they pick up the moisture off of Lake Ontario. So even though I'm very close to Buffalo, I don't get that kind of snow. I'm just watching it on the news, going, "Oh my, you know, that's bad." And it's, just on the news, as much as the news was on those days, it wasn't like these days where you got 24/7 news. And then Leonard, now whether it was on Leonard or whether I was watching something else, but they're doing the ice cores and they realized that from the coldest to the warmest, that switch, like this switch happens real fast from the coldest temperatures to the warmest. I think it was as little as 4 years, or maybe it was 2 years. And in the opposite direction, it was as little as 1 to 2 years. So you could go from the warmest to the coldest in 1 to 2 years. You could have your ice age onset happen so rapidly you're screwed. If you weren't prepared for it in advance, you weren't going to be able to prepare for it. If you could have a freeze off in 1 or 2 years, then yeah, you're done. I don't see that being a survivable event. And, you know, Buffalo, case in point, right? Like they were able to go in there and clean it up, although, you had loss of life and you certainly had disruption, but it wasn't a consistent thing. It didn't keep snowing.
Yeah, I'd
And
read
it
some peer
became,
reviewed studies as well, like a Link Springer, I think it was. And they had the same similar range, 10-year onset all the way out to like 1,000-year onset, gradual. There's been, and they were going back something like 50 ice ages. And you have to realize that's 5 million years of time, not this last few years since 1979 that they use as the climate record now. And they're encompassing, full 5 million years in the onsets and declines. And yeah, there's a huge range. And you were mentioning that even faster than 10 years on an onset. So that kind of is right in that whole peer-reviewed research of information that very few people hear about or even know that something climatically can shift that fast into the point of being habitable, into the point of, oh, this entire section of a state, a province is no longer habitable, except for maybe certain very short windows of time in the year or not any longer, and then people need to move out. I was just wondering, like the Dust Bowl, the onset of the Dust Bowl was about 3 years, and this is the 1930s, and we had that this time of Great Depression, and farming was off there, and just like these massive amounts of dust because and it stayed like that for about 7 years of very little rainfall, and then boom, it just turned right back on again, and then it began. The cycle was that on an extreme dry, and then it just turned right back off again, and then the rains came back, and then muddy for first year, but then those grasses grew back, and the dust storm ceased. Yeah, right. And the onset can be tremendously fast, and then it could end tremendously fast as well. So
We get a lot of warnings about that, right? Joseph and the Pharaoh being the first one, right? 7 years of feasts, followed by 7 years of famine. And then if you read further, there's I don't know how many, if you've read through the Bible looking for those grand solar minimum, how many events there are. There's several. And then the last one is at the end of the Bible. The mother of all grand solar minimums. And you read that one, that's nasty. But there's some things in there that you would have read, or I would have read when I was a kid and thought, how does that work?
thinking about that, and just in the way that humans are being phased out of agriculture in itself, that's one of the scariest things. Is you're having AI determine what foods are grown, who gets the foods, and at the end of it, I'm sure the AI will determine distribution of the foods to which cells or cities or whatever it is aligned with, that those humans be fed these calories. And that's where you come in to try to take that stranglehold away from traditional agriculture and turn it into blockchain agriculture. And I like the idea that all elements of it can be traced on the blockchain. VeChain is one of those things for the supply chain management. Watching where products move from one to another, or the inputs, where do those go? How much is distributed? I'm not talking about distributed ledger. I mean, distributed onto the plans, like even down to the microgram. They can, and then that entry in is then put on the blockchain, so you can see from start to finish how much is in there, what's on the plants, what kind of fertilizers, what was the maintenance. You can see it from start to finish and know where it goes, who's touched it, what the inputs were, what country they came from. So this entire chain of visibility, I like much more than anything that, hey, it just came from a field. Okay. you know, there's the transparency of growing it in a dome, and also ownership of those barrels inside there. This is a very unique set of opportunities that are rolling and cascading and growing off of each other there. What's the user agreement? Like, what do they get out of this? They purchase one, then what happens? And then how is this split, divided? You're talking about agreements. Okay, let's talk about this one for a second.
So you get a third of the output of that barrel from the garden, from your NFT, and you get that in perpetuity. So you have to, leave it that to somebody in your will. So far the NFT is like, right, you buy in, you get this food rollout for life. But that's going to morph itself into a real estate deal where we flush out the habitat ring. There's got to be a reason to produce that food in that dome. And so taking us into the binary tightening up of a system, it all should be about efficiency, I believe. And if you don't want to have to travel to the store, to the work, to all these different things. Yeah, fine. Uh, the freedom to travel, absolutely. But the freedom not to have to travel anywhere, I think, is a superior freedom to the one that says, yeah, you're free to travel. Now you have to get in your car and go to work, get in your car and drive here to get this, to get that. That that's a lesser freedom than the freedom to not to have to travel anywhere.
Yeah, we're in a world where not a lot of people know how to operate. So we only have a couple minutes left here, Ted. So again, up on Solana blockchain, on Aptos and Cardano. Any last thoughts to try to share? Like, we're stepping into a world, people just aren't going to know how to operate in this world. I mean, we were slowly fed debit cards and credit cards. For those of you that are young, realize that having a credit card used to be like a huge privilege back in the day. Everybody didn't have one. You had to be pre-approved by a bank. You had a certain amount of income, and then they gave you one. But now it's just like they're throwing them out like candy. So wind it back to the day, people don't even know what those ATM cards that you're like, everybody's got an A. There's an ATM in every country. I can use it everywhere. No, we used to use traveler's checks when we would go traveling. You had to buy those, and they were 2% premium, unlike American Express traveler's checks, and they would replace them if they were stolen because you had the number on them, very much like a cashier's check. I mean, we had to learn all these new things. Online banking, that was not never. You had to learn that. I was almost terrified the first few times getting, oh, what if I hit it and it erases my funds? Like, you got to realize the world we were in before, of no convenience for banking, had to be taught to us. They had to train you how to get to credit cards, debit cards, use them. Oh, and then finally overseas, that whole arena opened because the credit cards that you had originally only worked in pretty much specifically the country or the continent that you were on. So if you're in the US, you could use your credit card in Canada. All right, so we're entering a world again where everybody has to be completely re-educated on how blockchain works, what's a cold wallet, what do these different blockchains that, Solana, Aptos, and Cardano, how do they operate? Why are they special? Even the vocabulary of this new world, we're already in it for most of the part. We're in the transition. There's a parallel system moving, and that transition in the parallel is happening right now. So, any last thoughts on that? And everybody, thank you for spending your valuable time with us. I know we went out on a few different directions.
Throughout history, it seems to be the wheat that's the thing that gets super expensive. Bread becomes the super expensive thing. The Weimar, what was it, 20 billion Deutschmarks for a loaf of bread from 1 to 20 million? Or was it 20 billion? It was a number with a lot of zeros anyway. So it seems to be it's the stable, and the currency is the thing that's not stable. So you want to be the producer of the bread, even though that's a dangerous thing when there's very few bread producers, because breaking bread is one of those things you want to be able to keep doing.